Tonight, we will hear from 3 experts in economic forecasting and development as they share their regional, national, and international perspectives on the economic outlook for the coming year. Ohio Wesleyan's Department of Economics offers majors in 6 areas: accounting, business administration, economics, finance economics, international business, and management economics. All of these recognize the central role of economic thinking in today's decisions. The Walter Motti Center's mission is to enhance academic programming and provide real-world opportunities to create future business and world leaders. Tonight, we thank OWU's provost, Chuck Steinmetz, who joins us tonight to introduce our panel.
This is your 4th time, right? 3rd or 4th?
Well, on behalf of Ohio Wesleyan, let me welcome you to this event, this Economic Outlook Conference. I know it's a wonderful event because I've seen so many repeat visitors to this event. So thank you for coming this evening. And special thank you to all the students in the audience. It's great to see so many of you here at this event at a busy time of the semester. So my role in this event is to introduce our moderator. Our moderator for this evening is Goran Skasplis, who joined Ohio Wesleyan in 2006. His teaching focus includes economics of transition, macroeconomics, developmental economics, international economics, research method, and economic principles. You wonder what he doesn't know at this point. His research deals with institutional changes in post-communist countries of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. He also deals in banking and credit and small business finance. He earned his bachelor degree from Lake Forest College and both his master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Goran to the podium to begin our event and introduce our speakers this evening.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Chuck. Well, welcome this evening. Welcome, everyone. We have 3 distinguished panelists with us tonight. The first one is Mr. Bob Lamb, who is an Economic Development Director for Delaware County. As we've seen a lot of different projects come up in Delaware, he must be doing his job really well. I want to know what's going to open up next to Panera. That's my question. That's what I want to get out of this lecture tonight. He has been a city development director at Upper Arlington prior to coming here, and he spent some time in Arizona, in the city of Glendale. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the local economy tonight. The national outlook will be presented by Dr. Mark Schweitzer from the Cleveland Federal Reserve Bank. Earlier today, he was presented with a five-timer club card because this is his 5th time being here. We love having him here every time. He does a wonderful job presenting and giving us an outlook. And of course, he'll do the disclaimer that those are his opinions, not opinions of the Cleveland Fed. He is ahead of the research department at the Cleveland Fed, and his research interests are in labor economics and macroeconomic impacts of labor issues. Looking forward to hearing the national outlook from you, Mark. And finally, we have Mr. Andrew Will, who is our alum, and that's the first time in our 13 years of having an Outlook conference at Ohio Wesleyan to have an OWU alum. And I had him in my class in the past, so I'm really looking forward to seeing what he has to say. He graduated in 2009, then went on to get a master's degree in economics at Ohio State, and then took a position with Hartford Investment Management. He's been there since 2011, working on international investing and analyzing the international economic situation. He took Ian Sheldon's class. Ian has been our panelist several times in the past. greatness passes on. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the international outlook. So how this is going to go tonight? First, we're going to have each panelist do about 10 to 12 minute presentation. Once they're done, I'm going to ask each one of them to ask each other some questions if they have any, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the audience to ask questions. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, and hopefully we have a wonderful evening tonight. The first panelist will be Andrew, talking about the international economy. Andrew?
Everybody hear me if I don't use the mic? Any issues? It's recorded, so we need to. Yeah, yes. All right. Well, so guess we're using the mic. So I'm going to approach this a little bit differently here. I'm going to just take a couple of slides to set up a framework that I think is a useful way to think about the global economy, monetary policy, and then we're going to work through a couple more slides at the end to apply those theses that we're working with to where we are today in terms of a growth environment and where I think we're likely to be heading in the ensuing 12 months. So with that, the first couple of slides are going to be pretty high level. Please, if you have questions as related to the discussion of these slides, ask away during the presentation. If you feel like discussing things like Brexit, China, Europe, etc., try to save those questions to the end, and we can kind of address those in isolation. So with that, we'll get going here. So, all right, so on this slide, it's a stylized version of a couple of different cycles that we see in economies. So the blue line, the big line, that's your traditional business cycle. So you think about moving from recession into recovery, and then ultimately back into recession as the business cycle matures. We tend to think of a business cycle as ranging somewhere from 7 to 10 years. No reason that it has to be as short as 7 years. No reason that it couldn't be longer than 10. But that's kind of a rough range that we like to think about. So if you start in 2008 when we had a very, very nasty recession, we've really had a nice progression out of that recession over the past 8 or so years, and we're now fully in the recovery phase. And now kind of the debate is shifting to, well, are we at the end of the recovery? Are we going to start dipping into recession, or do we have another couple of years like this? And this is from a global context, once again. The thing that I think a lot of people tend to miss when they're looking at the business cycle is some of the underlying monetary cycle. Traditionally, we think of a monetary cycle as the Federal Reserve either hiking or lowering interest rates to basically adapt to what they're seeing in the economy. So if growth and inflation are running very strong, they'll tend to hike interest rates in that environment. And if they think they need to support the economy, they'll traditionally cut interest rates, because in doing that, they help to basically incentivize credit lending to the economy, and thereby investment and consumption and driving growth forward. Post-crisis, so basically after 2008, the Fed was forced to use some new tools, as were other central banks around the world. So we'll think about places like in Europe, they have the European Central Bank. In Japan, they have the Bank of Japan. And then also in China, we have the People's Bank of China. Those are kind of the four main areas that we're going to look at today. But the punchline being, they're using new tools now, and these new tools tend to be utilized maybe a little more quickly than traditional interest rate hikes or interest rate cuts. And that's what I've tried to mimic with the green line up there. So you're going to see a higher frequency cycle interacting with the broader business cycle, which is once again the big blue line. So we'll go to the next slide here, number 3, and we're just going to dive in at a high level to what a monetary cycle looks like. And once again, keep in mind, this is now on a shorter time wave. So maybe this is occurring over a 2-year cycle as opposed to the traditional 4 or 5 to 10-year cycle. So let's start in the very top with liquidity tightens. That's the box right in the center. Essentially what that means is the Fed is hiking interest rates. They're making money more expensive, and thus they're trying to constrain credit growth. They'll do that, as I said once before, when growth starts to get too strong and inflation starts to run hot. So they're reacting and they're attempting to try to cool down the economy to keep the business cycle going. So if everything goes according to plan, we're going to wind around this loop in a clockwise fashion, and growth now starts to slow because investment is slowing, as is consumption. So the Fed has theoretically accomplished its mission, or any other central bank globally could be doing the same thing. They've accomplished their mission. If they go too far and growth slows too much, now they've got to ease again, right? So I've got down there in the lower right-hand corner, central bank eases, liquidity improves, right? Credit creation is once again ramping back up. People are taking out loans. Corporations are issuing debt. They're starting to invest. They're starting to consume again. And on the outswing from that, we get growth reaccelerating in box 4. So we basically got this cycle that occurs relatively quickly in the post-crisis environment, maybe a 2 to 3 year cycle. And we're going to apply this cycle to where we are today in terms of a global growth backdrop as the Fed, the European Central Bank, the Chinese Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan all look to use these monetary or interest rate tools that they have available to them to control the economic cycle. So where are we today in terms of a growth profile? So if we start in kind of the far left here, I've broken this out into 4 primary regions that are fairly easy to comprehend. We've got the European Big Four, so that's Germany, France, Spain, and Italy. Those are the 4 primarily largest economies in Europe. And we're going to use those as a proxy for Europe, so far left here. Then we've also got the rest of the world, which is just trying to capture everything outside of the U.S., and then the BRICS, which is an acronym for key emerging market economies. So the B stands for Brazil, R for Russia, India is the I, and China is the C. And so really the main takeaway on this slide is that if you now move all the way to the far right, you'll see some growth rates that we saw in the 4th quarter of 2016. And then as we progress left, you'll see that growth is pretty consistently picking up in all 4 regions of the world here over those several quarters there. And so we're at a point in the business cycle here where growth is good. China is growing well. The emerging markets are generally growing well. Europe is growing very well. And the U.S. is doing about what it's been doing to a little bit better. So overall, we've got a very good backdrop here. And to the point now where growth in most of these economies is above potential. And potential growth is a fancy term, but really just think about it as a sustainable growth rate that the economy can achieve without driving inflation to intolerable levels. So basically driving prices higher and thus creating other problems in the economy. So we've got a backdrop today where things look pretty daggone good globally. So what does that mean now for the monetary cycle? So you'll see here, we've got a chart up here that roughly resembles that green line in the very first slide that I showed, right? The green line was a stylized version of the monetary cycle on a short-term basis. Here we see what it actually looks like when we see the data coming out from these economies. And what we have on the actual chart is credit creation. And I use credit creation as somewhat of a proxy for whether the central banks are effectively using their policy tools to push credit into the system. So are people taking out loans, maybe for housing, maybe to finance their consumption? Are businesses taking out debt to finance investment? And so what you'll see here is in 2016, primarily that big green mountain towards the right-hand side of your chart, we had a very nice credit impulse. We had a lot of credit being pushed into the system, particularly from China and the euro area. And the reason that happened is because central banks eased up policy prior to that, and it stimulated this credit impulse in the global economy. And so that's why we're seeing really good growth today, because this credit flowed into the system previously, and now we're seeing the benefits of that globally. And at this point now, with growth doing so well, central banks are actually doing the opposite. Instead of easing, they're starting to tighten up here. So particularly in China and the US, we're seeing central bankers tighten up credit. They're making interest rates higher, thereby making credit more expensive. And on the other side of that, we would expect demand for credit to fall. And indeed, that's what we're starting to see. You can see that that line has dipped below the x-axis on that graph. So now credit is starting to contract somewhat. That's the natural response. But because of that, starting to get a little bit nervous that growth 9 to 12 months out from a global perspective will start to slow down here some, because people aren't going to be investing as much and they won't be consuming as much, given some of these policies that the central banks are utilizing. So that's the backdrop we've got. Let's drill down just a little bit more. So as I said before, we've got globally very good growth. And you'll see on this chart, it's a lot of spaghetti, right? But the key takeaway here is that, sorry. Key takeaway here is that your lines are basically all on top of each other. Nobody's dragging down the rest of the world. Everybody's growth is doing pretty daggone well right now. And that's creating a virtuous cycle amongst economies as they interact with each other. Everybody's buying, everybody's investing, and that is self-reinforcing at the end of the day. So we've got a growth backdrop that's good. As I mentioned, central banks are now starting to tighten up, and I think the outcome 9 to 12 months from now will be slightly slower growth. But right now we've got a window here where the economy looks pretty good from a global perspective. One thing we haven't talked a whole lot about yet is the inflationary backdrop. It's a key piece of the global economy. Essentially, as growth accelerates, we'd expect inflation to move up, and that's because as people are buying more, investing more, they're demanding more inputs to what they're doing, and that drives prices up ultimately. And so one of the big conundrums following the financial crisis in 2008 was very low inflation, abnormally low inflation, to the point where it was almost difficult to understand why it was so low. We have started to see finally an uptick, and that's because growth has finally gotten onto a consistent path upward. And so we're seeing modest upward pressure in inflation, and that's what the central banks are once again responding to. In terms of the overall inflation environment, I don't think you ought to be particularly concerned about inflation running away at this point from a global perspective. We have a lot of structural things that I think are going to keep inflation low overall. And what are those things that we're looking to, right? Well, we know that demographics are poor in a lot of the world at this point. So we have a lot of older people as they move into retirement. We would expect them to buy less. So that's a structural depressor on demand globally going forward in my mind. We also see technology as helping to suppress price inflation. So if you just think about, for example, Uber, that's an example of a company that's coming in and disrupting a market, right? It's taking taxis cheaper. If we see enough of those type of instances globally, then it helps put downward pressure on inflation, and indeed, I think that's what we're seeing here. So overall, you've got some modest upward pressure on inflation, but nothing to be worried about. This is not the 1980s where you're about to see rampant runaway inflation that the central banks have to be very concerned about and therefore aggressively react with higher rates. So just to wrap it up really quick, we've got a very good economic environment at this point. It's going to put some upward pressure on inflation. Nothing particularly to worry about in my mind at this stage. Focus particularly on areas like Europe and China at this point. That's where the real strength is coming from in my mind. And then what's this eliciting? It's eliciting a response from the central banks. They are tightening policy, and as that flows through over the next year or so, do expect some modest slowdown in growth, simply because their policies will have the impact that they hope for, and that's just to kind of tamp down on growth overall, limit credit creation, limit the expansion of debt levels in some of these economies. But ultimately, that's a good thing. That is really helping to breed stability in the system. You don't want aggressive, excessive debt overall, and to me it feels like central bankers have a pretty good grasp of the situation at this stage.
Thank you, Andrew. Mark. This one. There you go.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and I'm happy to be back here in Delaware. And I do, as an annual reminder, point out that this is my disclaimer, that this is not the opinion of the Federal Reserve Bank. I want to keep my job. So the issue about thinking about a Goldilocks economy came up, and I was looking around for appropriate Goldilocks points, and I thought this one was actually great. The big bowl can't possibly be too hot. I mean, that's the wrong ordering. So a little bit of physics, but we do want to focus a bit of attention on this Goldilocks economy, because I think that's kind of the takeaway that we've heard already today. I like to show you some data. I don't want you to try to capture every element of this, but I want to kind of walk through, sort of how do I look at the data, how do I think about where we are today. we have been seeing really solid growth. Growth is typically a little variable. Where does that variability come from? It comes from the fact that, when you think about GDP growth, it's coming from various sectors. The one that I really want to be confident is going to be there is the consumer. So if I want GDP growth and I want it to be steady and stable, I want to see steady consumption numbers. Looking over the last year, we've seen really steady consumption growth, and we've seen, sort of normal variability in other sources, and we've ended up with pretty solid-looking GDP numbers. The committee is going to agree with the sort of relatively benign-looking outlook that was offered, that 2017 has been a pretty strong year. The FOMC, so the people voting on monetary policy, the people who are responsible for that monetary cycle, are expecting that growth will slow down in the coming year, but not very much. So I want to highlight that when they think about what their policy is, when they think about what the right policy is for this environment, they're expecting growth to be only a little bit slower than it is today. So what about those recessions? So I was looking around thinking about what should I show for recessions. And this is the NBER chart of every recession since the 1920s. And so, you can look up there and see a couple different facts about it. I mean, first of all, you can see why the Great Depression is called the Great Depression. If you look at the amount of contraction there, 26% followed by 18%, that's really tough. And that gets you a very tough environment. At the bottom, you can see the Great Recession. We had about a 5% reduction in output. That was, huge in our lifetime. So that was a very large event compared to everything before that. The other thing I like to point out is, these sort of years, I mean, the point was raised that, recession, business cycles are roughly between 7 and 10 years. I personally don't like that view. They vary a lot. They've been really short. You've seen really short recoveries. We've seen very long recoveries. And I want to talk to you today about why I think this is going to be even longer. So let's talk about that. Well, one of the first things you want to see is sort of where are conditions. So one of the things I want to think about are what a business is thinking about. And business sentiment here is, relatively high and has been rising. So businesses are more optimistic about their current situation. That's not a recipe for things to slow down. That is an ongoing, substantial recovery. Well, what about consumers? Are consumers overextended? So one of the things that we like to look at is how much of the consumer's budget is going to their debt payments. That's a debt service ratio. If you were a banker, that's one of the things you check off when you want to make sure your consumer is able to buy the house. On this basis, we've been seeing the debt service levels are, relatively moderate, much lower than they were in the Great Recession. They have come down. They have not, people are borrowing more, but they are not borrowing significantly more. They're well within their means. And I've put up here 4th District. So I am at the Cleveland Fed. Our district is all of Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Kentucky, and the little northern panhandle of West Virginia. So I want to think about sort of, how is our region performing too? And that analog is going to be very similar to what you would get if I just brought up Ohio numbers. So one of the things we're doing is trying to make sure that our region is also performing similarly. And you can again see that consumers are in good standing. So the last thing that I want to point out and sort of why I don't see a likely recession is that the labor market just keeps coming along and surprising on the upside. So we have the longest period of time, and I'm forgetting how many months it is. It's 87 maybe, 87 straight months of positive employment growth. We had a negative month last month with the hurricanes, but revisions revised that away. So we've got another longer series than we've ever had before. So with a labor market that's continuing to make progress, again, that's not the sort of thing that I see going into a recession. And here I wanted to look a little further back just to show you that if I look at going into either of the past 2 recessions, that I actually see employment slowing down in advance. So as a labor economist, when I want to see something going wrong in my labor market before I really start worrying about a recession. Okay, so that brings up the other problem. Are we getting too hot? And, you know, that's a difficult thing to raise in Ohio in the midwinter here, or start of winter, where we're clearly not too hot. But, I mean, there is concern about sort of, is our economy too hot? And, you know, would we need to change policy more rapidly? And, you know, you're going to see that most concretely in thinking about the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate, after having been above 10%, which, by the way, if you were a student here, you're grateful you did not exit the university that year, because you don't want to enter the labor market in the year where you have 10% unemployment. So right now we've had 5%. We're in the vicinity of 5%. You know, in the district where United States has continued to see even lower unemployment rates. The issue was raised about sort of how much potential growth is there in our economy, and one of the first places you're going to see the sort of potential rearing its head and saying, you know, we're going to have weaker growth is in unemployment rates. Looking at what the FOMC is projecting for unemployment rates, they are now increasingly viewing it as likely that we'll see that 4% unemployment rate. But that in the longer run being over there on the right-hand side, they don't think we can sustain an unemployment rate as low as we'll ultimately reach. So that is about thinking about going at potential and going through potential. And, you know, as a labor economist, I'm like, you know, well, we'll recruit more workers. We'll bring more people out of who are out of the labor market. You'll do a lot of things in that environment. One of the things that that environment should do that we would normally expect is push up inflation, and that's going to happen, you know, noticeably through wage growth. Now, I've got multiple different measures of wage growth here, and you can see there is a little bit of an upward trajectory there. So when we were looking at inflation internationally, you know, you have to really look at the T marks to see any sort of upward trend there. We can see a little bit of a trend here in wages. But I want to point out a couple things here. One, if I go back to 2004, 2006, the numbers there are just higher than we're seeing today. So we are still not seeing a labor market that's producing a tremendous amount of wage growth. If I go back even further, it's going to be even higher. So again, you know, we're making progress there, but I don't view it as a market that is so tight that we're seeing, you know, some sort of really strong inflationary impulse. And in fact, when I think about where we are on inflation today, I've got two different measures here. I've got headline, that includes energy prices. And energy prices rise, they fall. You know, happily, gasoline prices have done enough rising and falling that nobody in the audience should question that anymore. But that's the reason why, as economists, we don't tend to focus on that series. We look at the core measures because they are actually a better measure for sort of where things are going. But even on core inflation, we're running below the FOMC's long-run objective of 2%. So we are still seeing very moderate inflation in the United States. And one of the key components that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about in inflation is, you know, people think about buying things. But actually, things are not the primary part of inflation. Services actually are. So your education is a very expensive service, and it's one that's had a fair amount of rises. But the largest service you have is your house. So whether you're a homeowner and we've got a rental equivalent value for your house, or you're a renter, that is your primary expense, and therefore it's the largest portion of your budget. Interestingly enough, we've been noticing throughout most of the region, but not Columbus, that we've been seeing rent prices actually starting to decline. So we've seen them, you know, actually slowing down a bit. Why? Because there was just so much new material coming on board. So overall, the FOMC is expecting that inflation will gradually move up towards the 2% objective. It being an objective, that is what we expect in the long run as well, as we expect to achieve a 2% rate. So, are things still too cold? So I didn't want to pick on Central Ohio, so I've got my hometown here. We got Cleveland. Go Browns. It's tough. It's tough. So we got Cleveland here, and it looks really cold because I tell you, when you're out on that lake, it is cold. So are we too cold? Are things really getting tough here in Ohio? And this is actually a really interesting chart. One of the things that I specialize in is actually the region. And here what I've done is I have little dots. Every dot represents 5 jobs. A red dot means you have 5 fewer jobs in that county than you used to. A blue dot means you've got 5 more. This is over a year period. Well, right away, I ask you if you can find, Columbus. And you could therefore figure out where Delaware County is. And, basically a lot of our job growth in the entire state of Ohio is happening in Columbus and Cincinnati, and less so in the rest of the state. The other thing that's a little bit interesting here is that when you think about rural parts of the U.S., we are seeing a very significant rural and metropolitan divide. So a lot of the rural areas are seeing less strong growth as well. But on balance, I would definitely say that we continue to see good growth in our district, and in particular in the metropolitan parts. That difference in growth shows up, of course, in unemployment rates. That pattern is more or less the normal pattern of this region, that we do see the sort of Appalachian counties as having relatively high unemployment, and the others having generally lower. But we are hitting pretty low levels in a lot of our counties, and a lot of our very most populous counties, including here in the Columbus area. So today's policy environment, that would be the Federal Reserve Bank Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. And they are expecting a very moderate increase in interest rates. So I would say, yes, we are in an environment where interest rates are rising. But I would point out that we're expecting to end 2017, and each dot represents a voting member of the FOMC. So the vast majority of FOMC members are expecting interest rates to be between 1.25% and 1.5% at the end of the year. Now, that's not the loan that any of us get, unless you're getting a heavily subsidized loan. But no, that's not the rate we get. But that is the interbank rate overnight. And that has a lot of influence over the rates that we get. But I would actually counter the view that there's a significant amount of tightening here. We are tightening, but this is not a very strong tightening cycle. This is a very gradual path for interest rates. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And finally, we have Bob Lamb.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. Sorry that I couldn't make the dinner. I was with our county's finance authority. Before I get going into my presentation, I would like to take the opportunity to recognize a few people that are here tonight. County Commissioner Jeff Benton is here, along with the president of the Big Walnut School Board, Andy Wecker, and then also Sean Hughes, who is the Economic Development Director for the City of Delaware. So I am with the county, and I want to quickly give you an overview of Central Ohio, really the Columbus MSA region, and then Delaware. And since the door's already been open on the Browns, and as a Browns fan, I've not been able to use this word all season, I'm going to say that we can say we are winning as a region. No, we are really leading the way. In the last few years, the Columbus MSA has been designated as the fastest growing city in the Midwest, #1 for job creation and growth, a smart city winner, as well as the most intelligent community in the world. I guess we could all debate that one, but we like to take it on. And then #1 metro for wage growth in the U.S. as well. So we're seeing a lot of great things happening. And some of them were just talked about. But one of the things that we really like to highlight is the fact that we have seen 18.3% growth within the private sector for job creation within Central Ohio. That puts us ahead of everyone else in the Midwest, and we expect that to continue going forward. From a regional economy standpoint, we are ahead of the other locations within the state, seeing approximately 15.5% growth within that area. and we have seen the highest job growth within the MSA really over the last 15, 17 years. And so again, these are numbers that are really exciting to see from an economic development standpoint. When we look at why this is really happening, population growth, as well as the investments that companies are making within our community. One of the things that I think is really an awesome fact to highlight is that we often hear about how millennials are leaving the community, that they don't want to stay in the Midwest. But this graph alone will show you that we're in the top 10 competing for millennials. And what that allows us to do is to bring a lot of young talent to the table, which helps us attract new businesses to the community. You'll actually see by this graph that we're ranked 57th for skilled job growth and net migration, putting us in almost the top 10% for overall throughout the country. Again, these are great numbers. This is why we're seeing companies wanting to locate here, wanting to make their next round of investments in this community, and that means there's job opportunities for people, which means they're increasing wages, which is money that they can spend within the community, and that's what's really driving everything that we're seeing here within Central Ohio. And so some of these are just some of the leading companies that exist within our community. Again, huge names, you know them. We're incredibly lucky to be able to call them community partners. And so now driving down into more of a local Delaware County experience, what is our role within this community and what have we seen happen over the years because of the growth? So by this chart, you can see that in 1990, we're about 67,000 people. Today, we're approximately 200,000, and we are on track to as early as 2040 hit 350,000. Again, it's a great thing that's happening within our community. We want to see growth, but it does also present some challenges that I'll be getting into that we need to make sure we're on top of so that we can remain a premier community for Central Ohio. From a population standpoint, we're about the third largest in the state as a county. Our median family income is approximately $92,000. That makes us the wealthiest county within the state. That is tracking up. We're approximately around $94,000 actually right now, and we're hoping to see that number rise to as much as $115,000 over the next 13 years as part of our economic development efforts to increase jobs within the county and to attract more residents to the community. So, home ownership rate is at approximately 82%. Again, that places us at the highest rate that within the state. From bachelor's degree standpoint, we're at 51% approximately for individual residents within the county who have at least a bachelor's degree. When we change that number to an associate's degree, it rises to 60%. That means that our general education attainment level is about 3 times that of an average community within the U.S. Again, it's why we're able to attract high-paying jobs, why we're able to engage these companies, because we have the workforce that they're looking for. Poverty rate is approximately 4.8%. On the revised numbers, I think that has fallen to approximately 3.8% in the last quarter or so. So again, we're very excited about that number. We're also seeing decreases in unemployment within the area, which does create some challenges when we're working with the business community and they're seeking to be able to fill open positions that they have. It is something that as we go out and we try to recruit new businesses and new investment to the community, we are challenged with, but again, it is a good challenge to have, and we are working with our community partners to address those challenges appropriately and to build relationships that will hopefully be able to provide those businesses with a pool of labor that they can pull from over the course of the years. And sorry, I jumped the slide ahead. What I wanted to do was to showcase to you that even though we have this great growth, especially on the residential side, it does create some unique challenges from a local government standpoint. And so when we look at this number, you'll see that we actually lead and assess land value for the major Central Ohio communities, your Dublins, your New Albany, Westerville, by quite a bit, many of these. However, the issue that we find within Olentangy is that this number is being driven by single-family homes. Single-family homes for a local government do not create revenue. It actually costs more dollars to be able to provide the services and the amenities that those single-family residents want within their community than that home value generates. Approximately, Olentangy Schools uses the figure that it takes about 18 years for one single-family home to cover the cost of a single student. So when homes on average are putting out 2 students per home, you're looking at 36 years for an average value single-family home within the Olentangy School District to generate the funds needed to cover the cost of that student. So when you're receiving most of your revenue from single-family homes, as this graph will show you, approximately 97% of all revenue to Olentangy schools is coming from single-family homes. That means as costs go up within your community, as needs of the schools go up, the only resource for that community is to go back to their homeowners within that community. We want to be working with the various businesses, developers, landowners throughout Central Ohio to provide opportunities for them to make commercial investments within the community so that those school districts, as well as the county overall, does not have to be going back to our property owners on a regular basis, especially on the single-family side, to ask for levies and increases in costs to continue to pay for services. We want to see a diversification of the economy, not only so that employment opportunities can exist within our community, but also so that a diversification of the tax base can exist. We are seeing some diversification occur within the county. I'm sure many of you are familiar with a lot of the growth that has occurred over the past few years, not just on the residential side, but also on the commercial side. Up here, this graph talks about several of the key projects that we've had occur, especially along the major growth corridors that we have within the county. Those corridors are 23, City of Delaware area, the 71 corridor. And so we've seen growth in the Westar Place out by Westerville. Renaissance Hotel has located there. It's also become what has been named the Medical Mile, with investments that have occurred from Ohio Health and other key partners within that region. The Cluster Park within City of Delaware is an amazing project. Sean Hughes has really led the effort on that. They've recently worked with the county to expand Sawmill, which has opened up more land within their region to be able to develop as an industrial park. Approximately 2,000 acres, I believe. Sean can correct me if I'm wrong on that. He's shaking his head yes, so I'm happy that I got it right. But what that really will do is provide an opportunity for higher paying jobs within the light industrial sector, manufacturing, boutique manufacturing especially, firms that aren't hiring 100 or 1,000 people, but they're hiring 15 or 20 chemists, electrical engineers, and those types of individuals that will really help drive growth within the region and diversify our economy. We're also seeing great investments out in the 7136 corridor. If you're familiar with Simon Tanger Mall, that recently opened the past year, and as a community, we've been very happy with that project. We're seeing new investments coming into that area. Nationwide, just in the past year, finished up approximately a $42 million investment in a sanitary sewer plant, which opens up about 1,000 acres for new development, 400 of that commercial. So again, as a community, we're excited about these opportunities emerging. We've seen great growth in Orange Township along the 23 corridor, and we expect to continue to see that corridor grow over the years. From a community standpoint, we have set certain goals that we want to hit. 56,000 net new jobs in the community, increasing the median family income to 115,000, as I previously mentioned, and at least 500 million infrastructure development. And why are these important? Because if you want to locate businesses in today's world, you have to have the sites ready, and that means you have to have infrastructure in place to accommodate those businesses' needs. And so we've really broken it down to addressing 3 key issues within the community to be able to be competitive. Infrastructure is number one. As I said, having the infrastructure up to the site, the water, the sewer, the fiber, all those things that a company is looking to have instantly have access to if they're going to choose your site. If you don't have these, if you don't have the information readily available for a company to process, they are not going to pick your site. They simply don't have the time to wait in today's market for you to bring the infrastructure to them. They want it there, and they want to be able to plug and play. Site development. We want key locations throughout the county that can be developed for industrial, office, or medical purposes. Again, factoring into those high-wage jobs that will allow residents within our community to not only live in the community, but also work in the community. And so that is a major driver for us. Approximately a commute time within Delaware County is 42 minutes. With our population growth, that easily becomes an hour and 15 minutes. We want to make sure we're doing everything to limit that factor to allow people to not only live within the community, but also to work within the community. And then again, on the tax policy and development process side, time is money for businesses and developers going forward. If you're taking them through an unknown process that has an unknown end, that has an unknown length of time, they're not going to want to do business in your community. We want to streamline the process, make it very clear what our expectations are for them, how long it will take to get through that process, so that as they're looking at where they want to invest, we've answered all the questions on the front end so that they are choosing to make their investments here in Delaware County, where we can hopefully diversify our tax base and lighten the load that we have on our single-family residents. So that is really my presentation. Just turn over.
Well, thank you, panelists, for these wonderful presentations. I would like to ask whether any of you have questions for any other panelists.
Yes. Mark. That's why they invite me back. So I was curious what your take is on why Columbus is seeing so much growth relative to other parts of the country now. What is it that's special and of that value right now for Columbus?
I think there are several key issues that go into that. I think one of the leading factors for growth within the Columbus region is the educational system that exists within the Columbus region, whether it's K through 12 or universities. We are incredibly fortunate to have great educational partners within this community, whether it's OU where we're at today, or OSU or Capital or others, as well as local education, which is helping to drive growth. In today's market, businesses are looking to see where is the talent, and they want to locate by the talent. And so in the partnerships that have been created over the past few years between the private sector, the public sector, and the educational sector, we've been able to create an environment that is attractive for people to make investments in, whether it's the short north, downtown Delaware, or Westerville, that provide a large opportunity for people who want to live here, but also be able to find the jobs that they now want, because we are providing those services that are attracting talent, which means we're attracting the business.
I thought I'd ask a question over here too. So when I'm thinking about the credit cycle and actual credit reductions in the U.S., I was kind of curious, where on the ground are we seeing sort of less credit? So I know there are many different credit series. So where are we seeing a pullback in our credit?
So from some of the stuff we're seeing, one of the areas where we are starting to see some moderation is in the consumer side, and particularly in some of the ABS sector. So when I say ABS, basically I'm talking about loans that are backed by assets, right? So if you take out a car loan, for instance, that would be an example of an asset-backed security. And that being one area where we are starting to see banks in particular tighten up a little bit. And so what that tells me is that banks are starting to get a little bit more concerned about potentially what the interest rate environment looks like, and also potentially whether consumers are as good a credit risk as they have been, i.e., are they getting nervous about a borrower's ability to repay that loan if something may go wrong. So to your point, we are seeing very good labor market dynamics, right? That's critical, right? But if that cycle started to turn, then you could start to see missed payments and more credit risk from the perspective of a bank that's extending credit to some of these more marginal borrowers that are kind of right on the line between being able to afford that slightly nicer car than the slightly cheaper one. So that would be one area. I mean, I have to acknowledge that at least on the corporate side, we're still seeing pretty decent demand for loans. Corporations are looking to issue debt in the public markets, and then they're potentially investing that back into the economy. One thing that gives me a little pause is if I see a corporation that is issuing debt to buy back its stock. And so the reason that would concern me is because it means they're not potentially seeing what they would believe are productive investments to make. And so the best thing they think to do is to buy back their stock and push up the price in the process. So that's another area that I'd watch. If I see excessive buyback of stock funded by debt in the corporate market, that would make me concerned. We're not seeing that in egregious levels right now, but it's certainly something to watch in the months and quarters ahead.
I guess my question for you would be, you touched on the difference that we're seeing within some of the regions that you focus on, whether it's the Columbus MSA compared to some of the more rural what are you expecting to see track over the next few years? A continued trend in that investment opportunity, or are you expecting to see a little more diversification in the rural market?
I think your answer on sort of thinking about why is Columbus successful is part of why I would expect this to be a longer run trend. I'm a little puzzled at why Columbus is that much more successful than other similarly educated workforce centers. But employers are growing more in educated workforce centers, so metropolitan areas are doing better. Therefore, younger people are choosing metropolitan places to live. So the combination is not a particularly, good-looking direction for rural areas.
Just to follow up real quickly on his question previously, talked a little bit about the U.S. One of the primary concerns that I see out there is really related to China in terms of its debt dynamics. So over the past 10 years or so, we've seen a massive increase in debt levels in China, right? And that's been one of the things that's supported their really strong growth levels that we've seen over the past decade. There's a point where that debt growth becomes unsustainable. And I don't think we're there yet, but it's clearly a concern that's starting to raise awareness within the country with respect to policymakers looking at ways that they can start to curtail that debt issuance and thereby put the country on a more sustainable path. So you have to think about this debt and credit cycle from kind of two perspectives. The first being that credit can drive growth in the near term, but at the cost of growing imbalances longer run as you get too much debt in the system. So a short-term pain, i.e. lower growth because you're restricting debt, could actually be a very good thing for the longer run as it sets you up for more stability in the out years. So it's a two-pronged beast, right? And it kind of depends on the perspective that you're looking at, whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, right? If I'm purely looking to achieve growth today, then I don't want to see credit reduction. If I want stability longer run, then it's probably a good thing and an appropriate policy to be pursuing. Got one question too on the U.S. if you don't mind. In terms of, so we hear a lot about tax policy coming out of Washington here. We have some details around it, but we don't know what it looks like, right? So at least not yet. So to the extent that you guys think about that and try to incorporate it into your analysis and your expectations, how do you treat it today when we really don't know quite what it looks like? And then how would your treatment of it change once we start to have specifics that you think you might be able to actually kind of wrap your mind around and work into your forecasts and expectations?
Yeah, I think, so when you're thinking about tax policy sort of out, and it's not clear exactly what it is, there are relatively simple rules of thumb that where you're going to have sort of more spending than you're going to have income growth. And that's fairly easy to put in. As you get to policies where you're looking at particular tax initiatives that are arguably supportive of growth in a direction and are going to be, then I think, that's actually something better analyzed by the Congressional Budget Office. And so we would pay attention to what are they telling us about that. But, we tend to think about it just as a relatively simple, are we sort of increasing disposable income or are we reducing disposable income?
I guess for both of you, I'd be wondering, what's your thought, especially for you on the labor side of things? As technology has been changing, we're seeing a shift within the labor market away from some of the entry-level jobs that are being replaced by technology. How are you forecasting the effect that will have on an economy within the next 2-5 years? And I guess I ask from a local standpoint because a lot of our businesses struggle on filling those entry-level jobs, and the question is that really going to be relevant within a few years, but also what other issues does that make from a labor economic standpoint?
Well, I think that's a really interesting point because, I think, longer run, we've seen a shift towards more educated workers and we've seen wages grow for more educated workers, despite the fact that we're producing more. That said, if I was asking around where do I see a lot of wage growth right now, we are seeing it in entry-level positions. And entry-level positions are relatively tight right now. And that will cause some substitution. But on the other hand, you're causing substitution in a market that is actually shrinking. So I'm, if I want to see a tighter labor market, I want to see wage growth, I want some of that to happen at the entry level. And, we haven't really seen a lot of wage pressures, but, to the extent that they're there, they're actually more present among entry-level jobs than anything else.
So to me, on the international side, this idea of technology substituting for labor is something that scares the hell out of me, frankly. And because as I look around the world at this point and I see kind of a hollowing out of certain income sectors on the consumer side, that causes problems as people struggle economically, right? They tend to rebel eventually, right? It creates frictions in society. People get frustrated and they express that, whether it's at the voting booth or protesting, et cetera, right? But as I look around a place, particularly like Europe in particular, that's where I see weak growth that we've had historically over the past probably 10 years or so. Then you add on top of that some of these structural changes related to technology, and that's suppressing wages in the aggregate. You start to get problems with populism and voters that now are kind of really swinging hard right, hard left, and creating disruptions to the status quo. And that's difficult to account for in terms of how those type of attitudes start to manifest in terms of policies. It's certainly destabilizing at some level, and it's something that I'm watching very closely over the next few years because it does concern me quite a bit.
Well, I had two quick questions. One was for Andrew about, you mentioned BRICS as countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, but you mostly spoke about China. I haven't really heard much about India or Russia or Brazil lately. So questions, what's going on there, and if you are aware of anything. And then for Mark, I had a question about some of the regional labor outlook and some of the tightening of migration policies that have been going on lately, and if you have seen any impacts of that.
So just to touch real quickly on the BRICS, or these kind of key emerging market economies, I think one of the reasons you haven't heard a whole lot in the news is because they're actually doing a good bit better than they were, right? So in terms of headline events, things are improving, and that's not particularly exciting for the news media to press as an issue, right? So if we think back about 2 or 3 years ago, 2014, 2015, countries like Russia, Brazil, and China to some degree all ran into trouble. They hit some bumps in there in terms of their economies, and there was some problems, right? They saw a massive currency devaluation, their equity markets took a dive, et cetera. So there were problems. Growth actually turned negative, particularly in Russia and Brazil. They're now starting to recover, and so they've gotten inflation under control at this point. Growth is starting to turn positive, and kind of coming back to the central bank narrative, because inflation is now under control, these central banks are able to start easing policy again, which is going to present some positive dynamics in my mind in terms of credit extension, and that's going to flow through to investment and consumption. And so particularly Brazil and Russia, I think the outlook there is actually pretty decent for the next 2 or 3 years, most likely, because they're starting to hit this virtual stage in the cycle where things should turn around and you should have some positive reinforcing dynamics from a cyclical standpoint.
So we do, and the Federal Reserve, spend a fair amount of time talking to businesses. And one of the places where you do see immigration policy affecting things is in the construction trades. And so we have been hearing that. I'm actually a little skeptical because wages in the construction trades have not come up as much as I would have guessed if they were really short of manpower. But it is a place where we frequently hear that, and that immigrant labor force has been an important part historically.
Well, we've been talking for about an hour here, and we'd like to hear from the audience. If you have any questions, we'd like to entertain those. Just if you have a question, please raise your arm, and you're going to get a microphone, which is important for the audience on the web. Thank you. Over here.
All right. Ian Sheldon from Ohio State. I have 2 questions. The first of these reflects the fact that I'm a trade economist, and the thing that keeps me awake right now are the NAFTA renegotiations. I think there's a pretty significant probability that the agreement's going to fall apart. And given that, I'd like to ask both Andrew and Mark, NAFTA accounts for over 25% of global GDP, $1 trillion worth of trade a year, second most integrated free trade agreement in the world. What's going to happen if the negotiations fall apart? And then the second question is, if we get a big enough shock to the economy like NAFTA falling apart, and this is to Mark, do we have enough wiggle room in interest rates, given we're still pretty close to the lower bound, to deal with such a significant shock to the economy? I'm sorry to throw cold water on your very optimistic forecast, guys, but this is the dismal science.
So I'm happy to comment a little bit on that. So I think the NAFTA agreement, as you described, is really large. That trade in North America is very deeply entrenched. When you think about our auto production, you think about a Honda, west of here, or you think about GM, in Youngstown area. They're very reliant on that continued trade. And so our auto contacts are deeply afraid of any shift in NAFTA. So I do think it is a big deal. I think most of the time when you see something that's that big and that problematic, most of the time people step back from it. So that would be my first answer. On the second answer, do we have, if we had a large shock, do we have the means and tools? I think, we're in the process of gradually raising interest rates. It's appropriate for the outlook. If rates go back down to zero, we're looking again at, sort of exceptional tools. And the Federal Open Market Committee has been clear that that is what you would get, that we cannot, we would need rates to be quite a bit higher to be able to react to a very large shock.
So I'll comment a little bit more from my perspective on Mexico. I don't follow Mexico particularly closely, but the couple of things so kind of first off, I would say I'm quite nervous about it as well. I actually think that this is a story that hasn't been getting much traction in the media. It's not part of the narrative right now, and I think we'll be talking about it quite a bit in the next 6 months. I think we're just about to start kind of really seeing that narrative perk up here, and I think it's going to be pretty problematic. It's going to make a lot of people nervous in my mind, because we've been talking about a lot of other stuff, right? We've been talking about a lot of things that businesses view positively, like tax reform, and so some of these more negative narratives just haven't been cropping up. As it relates to Mexico in particular, where it makes me nervous initially is on the political side. So the reaction from politicians running in Mexico is to attack Donald Trump, attack the U.S., and drive a narrative down there that is also resulting in fairly extreme narratives and potentially policies coming from some of these folks, because that's their rational response, right? It's just to push back extremely hard. So that's not good. To the extent that it does fall apart, and I think as a firm we're kind of thinking that that's a roughly a 30-35% chance that it actually just falls apart and it's kind of a hard split on NAFTA. If that were to occur, it's pretty destabilizing from a growth perspective in Mexico, and that has problems. If you have a state that's struggling economically on your southern border, right, that starts to open up other issues, like is that a catalyst for immigration, which then reverberates in the U.S., right? So I think it's going to be a very complex dynamic, one that's underappreciated at this point.
How you doing? My name is Dion Vassar. I am a grad student right now. And if I can take you back a little bit in your thought process of when you were graduating college. For us as a student, the focus, and as important as it is to the society and our community of GDP and inflation and everything, as a student, the major focus is entry-level positions into the workforce. So in that understanding, looking at the baby boomers as a generation, how is that going to affect us in terms of economic development? For either three of you, in your opinion, do you see in that forecast of the baby boomers retiring, how is that going to affect not just getting an entry-level position, but moving forward for us to stabilize ourselves in the economy as well. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to comment a little bit on the demographic cycle. So demographic cycle is very slow. And, you know, we are reaching this point where we're seeing a growing number of baby boomers departing from the workforce. One of the interesting facts, though, is, you know, that's been lowering our labor force participation rate. So that globally is, you know, having some reduced ability of the U.S. to grow. On the other hand, it is good for entering generations, and I think today's labor market is attractive for, you know, entering students and entering, you know, basically, you know, throughout the spectrum of possible entry positions. You know, this is a relatively good time to enter, and it turns out there's economic research that says you want to enter during good times. And you don't want to enter during bad times, and that's just bad luck because, you know, not everybody gets that choice. But, you know, it's a good time to be entering. The other thing I would say is that, you know, the entering, you know, I think we're expecting good growth. We're expecting years of continued growth. That's sort of where you would like to start out. You'd like to see that in your early career. It's one of the reasons why we treat keeping the labor market near full employment as one of the main objectives of the Federal Reserve.
From an economic development standpoint, what we hear from a lot of our businesses is that they're really looking for critical thinkers who are emerging from college. They're able to teach those skills that they specifically may need for that job, but where they're lacking is individuals that can really connect the dots, be able to work in a multifunctional environment to be able to meet the needs of today. And so as we engage a lot of the higher end businesses, they're not so interested in individuals who are streamlined in one particular category. They want to know that they can tackle multiple subject matters at a single time and put it together to really be able to come out and meet the needs of today. Because we don't deal a lot of silos anymore within the business community. It's a multiple overlap, and they want to make sure that you not only have the hard skill sets that may be involved with that, but also the soft skills to be able to work with a diversified team from both a professional standpoint and knowledge standpoint, but also from a background standpoint.
I think I would add kind of one other thing, and from a fairly high level, one of the things that we fret about internally is this idea that large segments of the population have insufficient retirement assets accumulated at this point, right? So the outcome from that is that they're forced to stay in the labor force longer than they would have historically, right? Basically the point that you're bringing up, right? So there's that dynamic that's likely to be with us for quite some time. There's also a structural change that I think has been occurring that's also contributing to that, which is as retirement programs move away from a pension, right, a defined benefit where you know how much you're going to be receiving each month in retirement income, that's a fairly steady thing you can build expectations around, right? Now we've moved increasingly to 401ks, right, where it's now upon the worker, the individual, to save money for themselves, and then that's what they'll be able to draw on. So that structural change is another thing that's contributing to retirement insecurity and forcing people to be in the labor force longer than they would have, say, 20 years ago, right? So those two dynamics, I think they're clearly here. I think they're probably likely to get a little bit worse. They're certainly not, in my mind, going away anytime soon. So it's going to be a structural challenge and a headwind, I think, for years, in my mind.
Got another question for Mr. Lamb. When you reviewed your presentation, you gave if you look at it at a SWOT analysis point of view for the Delaware County and development, you said that you're putting in these specific things. I think there was a strong focus on the strengths and opportunities within the Delaware County, but do you see any weaknesses or threats in terms of bringing this stuff into the community for us as citizens?
Yeah, I think the threats that are potentially out there are also related to a lot of the strengths. Growth is a threat if it's not handled properly. We talk about smart growth from our view, diversifying the market so that we're not just bringing residential, because we are overwhelmingly a bedroom community. If we continue to see only residential growth occur within the community, we will be bringing greater costs while not diversifying the market to secure that tax base from the commercial side. And so how will the schools be able to maintain the expectation of services that currently exist if we're drawing more students but not more revenue for them to provide services? How will we provide EMS service to an aging population if we do not diversify our tax base? Police services as well. So the way in which we are trying to address those weaknesses is through, as I just mentioned, smart growth. But that then also brings other costs, because now you're investing in infrastructure and you have to find the revenue to maintain that infrastructure as well. So the strengths that we have as a community can also very easily become our threats if we're not making sure we're diversifying the land uses within Delaware County.
My name is Bill Williams, and I am an investor in Delaware. Back in the 60s, we bought shares of stock to put the Pittsburgh Road in out here. Calumet Farms helped us get that industrial park started. And Delaware's done a great job with its leaders like Bob and Benton and our commissioners. I want to say that I have a very positive outlook to the future. We have Watson that's looking over us and able to solve a lot of our problems. We have artificial intelligence is just going to self-grow. We have Uber out there who, they don't own a car, yet they're the largest provider of transportation. We have hotel rooms, and the largest provider of hotel rooms doesn't own a hotel. We're growing all over the nation, all over the world, very fast. And eventually, with our self-driving cars, we will be able to increase our production, because we'll make those driving times production times. And we'll clean our energy, we'll clean our air, we will make those parking spots in downtown Columbus parks, green parks. We'll do a lot in the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. I'm soon be 82, and I'd sure like to be 42 to see all this come across.
Would you have a question for? Would you have a question for?
I have a question. I want to know from the Federal Reserve what you think of all of this, and how are we going to get that $4 trillion that's parked offshore back in our economy? And when we do, what's that going to do to our Federal Reserve, and how are we going to handle that?
Okay, so there are several different points there. So let me talk a little bit about productivity. So I'm very much interested in, we spend a lot of time thinking about sort of where productivity is. And one of the interesting things about today's environment, and you cited some really good examples, Uber, the rentals. There's a lot of things that are happening that are somewhat hard to measure. And so one of the things that may be happening is our actual growth rate may be understated. And there's a lot of debate in the economic profession about whether we are understating our growth, because we have not perceived some of what's happening on the internet as actual growth and activity. If that's the case, though, one of the things that would follow from that is that if those activities are growing, their prices are actually very low. So it would actually suggest that, if anything, inflation may actually be lower than it is today. So we are always kind of looking and trying to understand how has the new technologies that have come up, how have they altered what we're producing today, what we're pricing today. And so they're always a factor. And right now it's a real puzzle, because it's not really showing up in the GDP data. Going to offshore monies. So one of the things that, there is a lot of assets available to corporations. Those corporations have been holding assets abroad. That's a very big tax issue. It's not really a Federal Reserve issue. Those corporations often have access to capital in the U.S. that's based on the holdings that are abroad anyway. So I don't know if we would have a very large effect of that money actually showing up on U.S. accounts rather than being international. Because as long as I can borrow, or as long as I can, choose to spend those assets as I want, then I'm not really constrained. So it really comes down to how constrained people are. If there were a flood of extra liquidity, and I think that's kind of the argument that you're raising, then we would have to think about sort of how much credit is there too much credit, you get back to sort of what's the appropriate interest rate setting. But that environment would be one where you would see really large GDP growth, really large inflation. We're a long ways from really large GDP growth. That would be a pretty sharp change. But I think there are actually, if you think about the finances of a company like Apple, do they face any constraint right now in any investment that they would make? They have more than, the majority of their, assets are abroad. Is that in any way limiting what they do in the U.S.? And if the answer to that is no, then, sort of where the assets are repatriated is really not that relevant. So that would be, a thought, that's a thought, not necessarily a conclusion on sort of why that wouldn't be so problematic.
Hi, I'm Nick Adams. I'm an economics major here at Ohio Wesleyan University. I'd like to direct my question towards Bob Lamb. You said that you have to create the infrastructure for the businesses to move in, correct?
Yes, in today's market, if you really want to be able to attract businesses, you need the infrastructure in place.
Are you worried that if you build too much infrastructure and not enough businesses come, you'll be stuck with land that's been, I guess, renovated on and no income to see for it?
Yes, and that's where some of our strengths can also turn into a threat. If we overbuild infrastructure in the wrong location, we do create a risk for the community to have to pay for it. It's why we really try to pursue what we call P3 partnerships, where we're working with the private sector in a partnership structure with the public sector to be able to put this infrastructure in place so that we're leveraging different incentive agreements, whether it's tax increment financing or a community reinvestment area, which allow for diversion of tax dollars or forgiveness of tax dollars in order to make the company be able to allow those investments to occur on their behalf in a manner in which they can afford, or where we're doing it in a manner where in which when the company comes and we enact that TIF, we will be able to collect dollars back to see that investment occur. We recently entered into that type of an agreement with the developer of Creekside Industrial Park along 23 corridor. They're putting in the infrastructure right now. We're very confident that it will come up. We've already had interest in that site from the private sector to develop new buildings, which should bring hopefully as many as 700 jobs to the community.
Benny Schultz, something I haven't heard too much about tonight, but question is, how does the climbing costs of healthcare affect the future of our economies? Both, nationally, I guess, and locally.
It is the case that healthcare has been a growing share of our economy for a while. And healthcare costs have been rising more rapidly than other costs, and that shows up as we've got new medical facilities. He's got his medical mile out of this. We are seeing actual change there. But, like any other growth activity, you can't continue that on forever. And actually, somewhat interestingly, over the last several years, we've actually seen healthcare costs come down. So healthcare costs have been rising less quickly than they used to. And so we are seeing, some consolidation. Now, my contacts in the healthcare sector would tell you that we're seeing growth with consolidation happening simultaneously. So while we do see a lot of new medical things, we're also seeing some closure of older medical things. But overall, I completely agree. You can't continuously outgrow the rest of the economy because it's not really viable.
guess from a local business standpoint, really we're seeing how it affects their hiring structure and what the benefit packages that they're offering to workers, and we're seeing that create competition within the market as individuals are trying to secure labor and having to outbid the business next to them who may be offering a better package. And so that's from the business owners and those making investments here in the community. We hear a lot about on how can we be more competitive with other regions in that regard.
My name is Natalie Naslund. I'm a resident here. I just have a quick question. I hear on the news that banks, or I guess the government, is removing a lot of restrictions that the banks had received, when the 2008 economy collapsed, as far as loan restrictions and things. And how is that? Why are we doing that? Number one, if everything is going well. Two, how will that affect us U.S.-wise as well as globally? I mean, because globally, that was where, it was a domino effect. And so I'm just kind of curious, are we setting ourselves up for the same thing again?
Maybe this is a question I should be evading, but I'll go ahead and offer a quick answer. I think there were a lot of good reforms in Dodd-Frank, but Dodd-Frank is being, questioned. We're actually watching very carefully sort of how things get altered. I'd say in any regulatory environment, you make some choices about where you think the key things are to regulate at the time. And then actually after the fact, there'll be some adjustments. So I would hope that we would come out of this with some adjustments about places where people feel like we don't need as much regulation as we have today, but that we would keep many things intact. That's very much as a citizen rather than as a Federal Reserve Bank employee, because we are one of the places that is involved in regulation.
Just real quick on the international side. So if you think back to 2008, one of the reasons that crisis was so brutal globally is that it was a banking crisis in many different countries, simultaneous with a real estate crisis, right? And so those two really feed on each other, and that's kind of the most vicious dynamic that you can get in terms of a banking crisis levered to a real estate crisis. So we have cleansed a lot of the imbalances from that, right? So we had bank bailouts, which very politically unpopular, right? But they do help stabilize the system and allow you to start to grow again, right? So we've seen that post-crisis. I think the unfortunate reality, at least from my perspective, is that as society, as humans, we're kind of bound to repeat the same mistakes, right? And so memory is very short in a lot of instances, right? And so as you look around globally, right, you get banking crises. Somewhat due to, kind of a steady reduction in regulation over time on a 30 or 40-year cycle, right? So right now we look pretty good because we've healed a lot of the ills that we had in 2008. But I think if you're being honest about it, it'll probably be a fairly steady march in terms of reduction in regulation here, and that will sow the seeds for another crisis down the road. It's probably not going to be 5 or 10 years from now. But that steady march will probably lead us to problems once again. And they'll look pretty familiar to some of the things we've seen in the past 30 years, right? It'll be slightly different in the way it manifests or where the leverage resides, who gets caught on their back foot, basically, right? But you can be pretty confident that we will see that again.
Any last questions? Well, I definitely had a lot of fun today, and I learned a lot. For students, if you didn't catch that message from Mark, that you should go to the library right now and start studying and graduating as soon as you can, while the labor market is still hot. Here it is again. Thank you, Mark, for giving us an optimistic view what's in line for our graduates. Bob, great to hear that the Delaware County and the City of Delaware are doing well. Thank you for the pitch for liberal arts. That was free publicity that we are training our students to succeed well in the labor market, and that businesses are appreciating them. Although you still haven't answered me what's going to go up next to Panera. And for Andrew, I'm so proud to see a student graduate and blossom in a very successful and, even more importantly, an interesting economist. And thank you for coming and being here with us.
We don't even have that much bad things to talk about right now. I mean, that's
Yeah.
real interesting.
If Ian keeps throwing cold water on our hot party here, we'll disinvite him next year. Thank you all, and see you next year.